Hello, I'm Amanda Walker and welcome to Inside America, the show that brings you insight and analysis of the biggest issues facing the United States right now. In today's episode, boat bombings off the coast of Latin America. Are they justified? Are they legal? US military strikes have killed more than 50 people so far. The Trump administration says it's a war on drugs, but has provided little evidence to back that up.
To every terrorist thug smuggling poisonous drugs into the United States of America, please be warned that we will blow you out of existence.
With an apparent focus on Venezuelan boats in particular, is there a wider objective at play? Coming up, we'll discuss the possibility that America is pursuing regime change against an old enemy.
And they would like to install a U.S.-friendly government in Venezuela. That has been the plan for the past 25 years.
And we'll hear from experts on the legality of these deadly strikes.
The U.S. president is asserting a license to kill outside the law, a license to kill terrorists that he designates as such, a license to kill solely on his own say-so.
It's been 9 weeks since the first strike on a boat in the Caribbean Sea. The use of lethal force shocked many and drew huge criticism, but since then, the campaign has only ramped up. Bombing targets have become more widespread, sparking escalating tensions in the region. Here's the story so far. September 2nd, the first strike on an alleged drug boat bound for the US. The footage, posted by President Trump, had an accompanying message. Please let this serve as notice to anybody even thinking about bringing drugs into the United States of America. Beware. But this was no one-off warning. The past 2 months have seen strikes on multiple boats in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, killing dozens of people. The president says the strikes are a matter of national self-defense, claiming without evidence that drugs from the region were responsible for 300,000 US deaths last year.
This is a national security problem. They killed 300,000 people last year, these drugs coming in. They killed 300,000 Americans last year, and that gives you legal authority.
Fentanyl, the cause of most drug overdose deaths in America, does not come from Venezuela. The attacks have happened without any traditional declaration of war from Congress. Some lawmakers are raising questions, including from within the Republican Party.
But if they want all-out war where we kill anybody and everybody that is in the country of Venezuela or coming out, that has to have a declaration of war. It's something that is not pretty, very expensive, and I'm not in favor of declaring war on Venezuela, but the Congress should vote. The president shouldn't do this by himself.
A U.S. military buildup off South America has raised fears of invasion in Venezuela and speculation that Trump could try to topple President Nicolas Maduro. Ava Gollinger is an American attorney and journalist who was a legal advisor to former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez.
We haven't seen a buildup like this in the region, a U.S. military buildup, in decades. Certainly during the past 25 years that the U.S. has been undergoing efforts for regime change in Venezuela, it has never escalated to this point. The fact that matter is that Venezuela is an important strategic country in this hemisphere, and that there's figures inside the government who've been there and who are now in higher positions of power, like Marco Rubio, who have made it their objective to remove Maduro and his entourage from power. And they would like to install a U.S.-friendly government in Venezuela. That has been the plan for the past 25 years. It's been unsuccessful. Whether or not at this stage they can succeed through military force, it will have to be seen. But I think that's where things are escalating.
She says that escalation is only coming from one side.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has been publicly calling for peace. They've been trying to negotiate with the Trump administration since the start of this year, and they've been trying to negotiate a series of different, diplomatic engagements that now it seems like those have fallen apart. that the current policy of the Trump administration has put those aside, rejected that, and is moving more towards, this type of aggression. But I think on the Venezuelan side, they're not actively seeking any kind of, increased tensions with the United States.
Even before becoming Secretary of State, Marco Rubio has consistently advocated for regime change in oil-rich Venezuela, citing electoral fraud, suppression of opposition and human rights abuses.
Maduro is never going to agree to free and fair elections, ever, because he can't win one. He knows that. There isn't going to be a diplomatic solution, unfortunately, in the short term to some of this, particularly when you're dealing with authoritarians that are trying to figure out how to stay in power for the next 30 years.
Since his first term, Donald Trump has been pushing for more dramatic military action in Latin America. He has his wish, as the world wonders, what next? Well, regime change in Venezuela would be controversial to say the least. But if this is, as Donald Trump claims, all about stopping the flow of drugs into America, is there any justification for the use of lethal force? I put that question to Brian Finucane from the International Crisis Group. He's a former legal advisor at the State Department. Are these strikes legal?
No. They're illegal.
Tell me more.
We have a word, a technical term for premeditated killing outside of armed conflict. That term is murder. There's no plausible armed conflict here in the Pacific or the Caribbean. And there's no plausible claim that these strikes are being taken in self-defense of the United States or of U.S. persons.
Well, let's look at what the Trump administration is saying, that Maduro is head of a cartel that is flooding the U.S. with drugs, that this is formal armed conflict and a direct national security threat to the U.S. How do you answer that?
So that's a series of bogus narratives that this administration has put out. I think they've put these narratives out not just for the benefit of the American public and the Congress, but also potentially to convince the president himself to engage in a course of regime change towards Venezuela. And so to take those one at a time, what we have here are strikes on these vessels in the Caribbean and now the Pacific, but none of those boats seem to be carrying fentanyl, which is actually the drug that is killing the most Americans, which actually seems to be the drug that Trump is concerned about. He talks about each load killing 25,000 Americans. That's simply not true. It's also not true that there is some cartel de solas. My colleagues tell me that such cartel does not exist. That's what Trump alleges that Maduro is the head of. And it's also not true that there is an ongoing armed conflict in which these strikes are taking place in the context of. The United States is not established that it is targeting any organized armed group. It is not established that there is actually an armed conflict that would render these strikes lawful.
So obviously this is not a new issue. What was the previous strategy when it came to these boats that were bringing drugs?
So the U.S. government has a decades-long playbook for stopping, interdicting, boarding, searching, and where there's probable cause, taking into custody people aboard these vessels and processing them through the normal criminal justice system. And these interdictions were undertaken by the U.S. Coast Guard and Navy working jointly in a law enforcement paradigm, which lethal force would only be used as a last resort to self-defense against life and limb, not used in a first resort, which is what we see happening here.
So why this shift, big shift in U.S. foreign policy when you have the Trump administration with this war on cartels, focusing, as you say, on Venezuela, when you say also that the drugs originate largely from Mexico and Colombia, although Colombia has been pulled into this as well. What is the U.S. motive here when it comes to Venezuela specifically?
So there are multiple motives because there's multiple relevant actors within the U.S. executive branch. The president himself is mused about doing strikes on narcos, on cartels, and specifically fentanyl labs in Mexico, dating back to his first term in office, okay? Now, that would be catastrophic for U.S.-Mexican relations. Those are important bilateral relationship, cooperation on law enforcement, counter-narcotics, migration, important economic relationship with Mexico. And so it appears that people in the administration have steered President Trump's interest in doing performative strikes on narcos away from Mexico and elsewhere, okay? This coincides with an interest on the part of the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in regime change in Caracas. He's understood to be the driver of U.S. Venezuela policy at the moment, the driver of the larger military buildup in the Caribbean. And there's reporting that it was Secretary Rubio who sold the president on this narrative that Maduro is the head of a drug cartel, that this is about counter-narcotics, this is about counter-terrorism. And so you have these converging, the president's interest in performative military action, so he strikes a supposed terrorist, and also the Secretary of State's interest in toppling Maduro.
Does this tie into any of the immigration policy and strategy that we've seen as well, in terms of it being a deterrent, having a visual of a boat blowing up coming from one of these countries? Is that part of the strategy as well, do you think?
I think that's likely true. It also features into the larger narrative that this administration is putting out that Latin American immigrants to the United States are, quote, terrorists. Okay, they've used this and used wartime tools, wartime framing against migrants from Latin America to the United States. Recall earlier in the spring of this year, they designated the group Tren de Aragua, this criminal organization, under the Alien Enemies Act, and used that as a basis to deport hundreds of Venezuelan men to the prison Secot in El Salvador.
Is there likely to be any accountability here? Can any steps be taken to investigate these incidents? Do you see that as at all likely?
Yes, there is interest in the part of U.S. Congress. The minority party, the Democrats, have expressed interest in investigating these, including the ranking member on the House Armed Services Committee. Members of Congress have asked questions about this, and even Republicans who might be sympathetic and supportive of these strikes are not getting adequate information either about the facts or the legal justifications from the administration. So there's interest in investigating these. And in terms of accountability and pushback, again, that's going to have to come from Congress. And so the question is going to be one of political will. Will Congress fulfill its constitutional responsibilities, including with respect to regulating the use of force?
What do you think other Latin American countries are thinking, looking at what is happening here with Venezuela? Are they worried?
Well, I think there's mixed reactions in the region, given attitudes towards Maduro, given differing attitudes towards this U.S. president. As we've seen in the midst of all this, in the midst of the saber-rattling towards Caracas, the U.S. has also had a blow-up with Colombia. There's been a flare-up in the long-running tensions between President Trump and Gustavo Petro, the leader of Colombia. Ironically, this comes just after the United States targeted one of these vessels that it linked to ELN, one of the main rebel groups in Colombia. And then, like the next day, President Trump announced he was going to cut off aid to Colombia, aid that is supporting the Colombian military's military operations against ELN.
And could this just destabilize Venezuela further?
Certainly. The prospect of a clean or tidy regime change in Venezuela seems like fantasy. Okay, the hope, I think, on the part of Secretary Rubio is that this military buildup in the Caribbean, these performative strikes off the coast of Venezuela, will coerce Maduro into leaving power, or inspire people within his government to oust him. Okay, both of those goals seem highly unlikely to be achieved through this deployment. But failing that, it's possible that President Trump may be talked into taking military action directly against Venezuela. The president has mused about moving from strikes on land to from strikes on sea to strikes on land. And Venezuela seems like the likeliest target there for any such strikes on land.
And how would you compare this with during the Obama administration, the global war on terror and drone strikes against Yemen, for example?
So this administration has very consciously and cynically tried to repurpose the war on terror, the counterterrorism framing, and apply it to new foes. Narcos in Latin America, migrants coming to the United States, and domestic political opponents. Okay, the real problem here with that analogy, analogizing what's going on in the Caribbean to the war on terror, either under Bush, Obama, Biden, or the first term of Trump, is that it's completely different. On 9/11, the U.S. suffered an armed attack. Congress authorized use of military force. There was an actual armed conflict between the United States and al-Qaeda. None of that is true here.
So what precedent is being set here?
The U.S. president is asserting a license to kill outside the law, a license to kill terrorists that he designates as such, a license to kill solely on his own say-so. There's no obvious limiting principles. And because his administration has not referred not just to the people on these boats as terrorists, but also to immigrants and domestic political opponents, the concern is how this license to kill, this asserted prerogative, could be used elsewhere.
That was Brian Finucane, a former legal advisor at the State Department. Well, joining me now is Sarah Yeager, the Washington director of Human Rights Watch, and Derek Maltz, who has spent decades in drug enforcement, including a spell as the acting head of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency under Donald Trump. Thank you both for joining us. Sarah, let me start with you. These images of these strikes are becoming more frequent, more familiar, it seems. How would you characterize what we're witnessing?
Entirely unlawful is how I would characterize this. And I'm worried that people are being normalized to what amount to extrajudicial killings.
And Derek, how would you, from your background, your experience, just give us a sense of how these vessels are identified?
Well, there's a lot of intelligence. There's multiple agencies that are collecting intelligence. This isn't anything new. These boats have been leaving the coast of Venezuela because Venezuela is a command and control hub for global drug distribution, not just into America, but to all over the world, the Europe market, the West African market, and obviously there is an unholy alliance in Venezuela between the corrupt leaders in Venezuela with the narco-terrorists in Colombia, the FARC and the ELN. So they've been operating with impunity for 2 decades. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot of drugs moving around the world. And by the way, coca production right now in Colombia is at all-time high. So the narco-terrorists are taking total advantage of the markets around the world, not just the U.S.
But specifically Venezuela, a question to you both. We're talking about fentanyl, really, because that is the primary cause of drug overdose deaths in America. Fentanyl not coming through out of Venezuela, largely coming out of Mexico.
That's my understanding. But look, I would not diminish the problem with the drug trade. And I would not diminish the problem with cartels, especially when it comes to the United States and overdoses. What I am arguing is that this way of going about it, where there is lethal targeting of boats coming from Venezuela or Colombia, is unlawful. And it really, I worry about the United States and international law. I worry about our U.S. military personnel violating international law. This is just not the way to do it.
Derek, where's the evidence for who is on these boats and what is on these boats? Why aren't we seeing more of that? If the White House, the Trump administration is so confident in this, why are we not hearing more about the evidence that a lot of people are saying just isn't there?
Good question, and I would direct you to the White House on that one, but I'm hopeful because the president made a comment this past week that he expects that Secretary of War Hegseth would go to Congress and provide more transparency on the actual vessels and what they're seizing, who they're killing and stuff like that. But I want to clarify something for the record. This is not overdoses we're seeing in America. This is a mass poisoning against this country. We've never seen anything like this in the history of this country. I've been talking about this for over 8 years. I talked to the families that are burying their babies, literally infants, 3 months old, 2 months old, a year old. We've never had this happen. If you took ISIS, you took Hezbollah, you took Al-Qaeda, you can't even come close to the amount of deaths to American families over the last 10, 15 years. So we're not talking about overdosing. These kids are being deceived to death, and the enemies of this country are harming our citizens like we've never seen before.
I think you're both, sorry, one second, Sarah, you're both in agreement that this is a huge problem.
There's a difference, so overdose and poisoning is 2 different things.
Right.
This is a poison.
There is clearly a big drugs problem. But
Yes.
I think, Sarah, your point is that this is not the way to solve it. What would you like to see different here in terms of the approach?
Well, can I just go back quickly to the evidentiary aspects of this? I would love to see Secretary Hegseth come to Congress and show the evidence. However, even if these are drug smugglers, you cannot just kill them. The president cannot decide to kill people when and where he likes. That is a dangerous precedent to set around the world. Imagine if China decides that it wants to kill Americans in the Pacific Ocean. The drug smuggling is not a reason to create war. It is actually not a condition of war. And so these lethal strikes are just entirely unlawful. I would say that there are a number of things that could be done, and I actually defer to Derek on the things that could be done through law enforcement. Law enforcement and the military are 2 very different things, and they're separated for a good reason.
Derek, you are a man of the law. To Sarah's point, can you just go out and kill people like this? Surely
so,
not.
DEA and our law enforcement counterparts, and I ran the Special Operations Division for 10 years. I grew it from 9 to 30 agencies, so I worked very closely with SOCOM and SOUTHCOM and the intelligence community. But you have to understand, the law enforcement mission is to collect the evidence, to prosecute the traffickers, to prosecute the criminals, and bring them before the court, and to have them, pursuant to the law and order of our America, right, the rule of law, and we want to see them prosecuted. However, this administration has said from the beginning, even during the election, that they are going to hold these criminals accountable for killing Americans at record levels. So that's their decision. The president and the Secretary of War, the State Department, and the administration have decided that prosecuting these narco-terrorists is not good enough. It's not working. We're losing too many Americans. So they're trying other, techniques of using the military, using other tools of national power.
But how do we know that they're criminals? Because I want to point to something that Senator Rand Paul said, who's been very critical of this, a Republican. He recently said that a 2024 Coast Guard report found that 27% of drug boat searches came back empty-handed. And as a former DEA administrator, what do you make of that? Does that chime with what you've experienced? No. And what does it mean for these Venezuela boat strikes?
So what I would say is that we know, we've been following it closely. I mean, we did the indictments on some of the major Venezuelan criminals, okay, and the military officials that have been guarding these loads for years. What I would say is that the Secretary of War, the Secretary of State, the law enforcement agencies, the intelligence community have the evidence on these vessels and have actually seized. Like the Dominican Republic, for example, they held a press conference. They found like 400 bales of drugs that were floating in the ocean, and they had a press conference. And I anticipate we're going to see more and more of the evidence that they recovered. And I mean, I think that's important, to be honest. I think that the American public deserves, the transparency when we do this stuff and to explain it. But it's been really clear to me that the current administration is not going to tolerate the death and destruction of our families and our communities. And these are not drug traffickers. I want to be really clear. These are terrorists. I've been asking for the administration to declare them terrorists, and Trump won, and it didn't happen. But these are terrorists. And Jim Rao, the father who started the Families Against Fentanyl, says it best. This is a weapon of mass destruction. We've never seen this kind of death in our country from any chemical weapon, by the way. I'm not aware of any chemical weapon that's killed this many Americans. So this is different. This is not the same old drug crisis. This is much different, and this is why it's being handled a little differently.
Sarah, this is really gaining momentum, this whole operation, it feels like. Is it too late for checks and balances?
No, it's not. No, it is never too late for checks and balances. But I was with Derek on arrest, on prosecution. I was with you all the way up until you said that the president gets to make this decision about how to handle. That is not actually true. The Congress has to declare a war and has to authorize the use of military force. So within law enforcement, yes, those are President Trump's decisions. Within using the military for a war, no, that is not President Trump's decision.
So where is Congress in all of this?
So that's a great point. So let me make this really clear. I've never been involved in making a decision to use kinetic strikes. I don't even know, and I never even talked about what the authorities are for the president, but I'm confident, as President Trump said, Marco Rubio is probably, according to this president, the best Secretary of State we've ever had. So I'm very confident in their knowledge and their research and the lawyers that work with their team to make, the recommendations so they can act properly and lawfully.
I think the words are being thrown around a lot. Terrorism, narco-trafficking, narco-terrorism. Narco-terrorism is not a legal term. It is not in U.S. law. Terrorism has to do with political violence. This is not political violence. This is a law enforcement issue.
But these are strong words. They are words that back up what they're doing right now. How much of this is shock and awe?
I mean, they're using these words in order to create an armed conflict that does not exist. This is a made-up term, and they are creating a made-up armed conflict in order to be able to kill people. And that is devastating to the rule of law.
Derek, at this point, though, do you think that what's happening is legal? And if not, what message does that send to the rest of the world?
Again, I'm not in a position. I have never evaluated the legality of it.
You must have a view on it.
I have a view on it, and I've been saying it really clear. Those terrorists need to be treated as terrorists because our families are suffering, and I have first-hand information to make that statement because I deal with the families, okay? I help make the collages. The DEA has the Faces of Fentanyl exhibit with thousands of kids on the wall. They don't even have enough room to put the dead kids on the wall.
Okay.
So, and I'm involved with these projects. So yeah, I think they need to be dealt with aggressively. I'm very pleased with the aggressive techniques that we're using, but I want to see more. I want to see the captures and the prosecutions of El Mencho in Mexico, the leader of CJNG. I want to see Maduro out of power in Venezuela, because not only is he harming the world with his drugs, but he's harming the citizens of Venezuela.
Sarah, what's happening here has been referred to as outright murder, as extrajudicial killings. What message does it send to the rest of the world if America is behaving in this way?
So there's an incredible amount of suffering in the world, including what Derek just mentioned. There are tools to address that suffering depending on what the suffering is, who is causing it, and who should be held accountable. What I am saying is that the tools currently being used by the president are not appropriate. And we have these international laws that the United States helped create, which protect all of us, protect U.S. citizens, protect people in other countries, because a state cannot just go and kill who it wants to, when it wants to, for whatever reason it wants to. That's a safety for us. And if we're going to start crippling that and degrading it, it actually is a danger for all of us. So yes, there are tools that the president can use. There are sanctions, there are financial tools. But by creating this made-up conflict and calling them terrorists, it is really inappropriate, and I think it puts us all in danger.
Okay. Sarah, Derek, thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll be keeping a close eye on this story as it develops, and we'll be doing our best to keep across everything you need to know about here in the United States. Thanks for watching this episode of Inside America. We'll see you next time.